Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hidden Existence. I know it has been more than a minute since I've been here, but it is great to be back, and it's great to see you people back in the chat. Gary Spike Senior, good to see you. Sandra Piper and Radar, of course. Jean Hudson, good to see you too. I've got a great guest tonight. We're going to learn a lot tonight. I feel a doctor of English, which is really important, and we'll get into why that is important in a bit. But my guest has written no less than 16 books and of a variety of subjects, some bordering on the paranormal. And here's a little video of the cover of some of the books that Richard's wrote. I'm gonna have Richard back again because there's so many things I want to talk about. But tonight we're going to talk about animals and one particular animal, a dog, an amazing dog called Bobby, and we'll get into that. And we're definitely going to cover animal experiences, spiritual experiences, ghostly, maybe people who've had their beloved pets come back to see them after they've passed away. But we're going to get into all that. But welcome, Richard. Thanks for being here tonight.
Many thanks. It's great to meet you, and it's great to be talking about this subject. I keep finding new stories when I think I've seen the last of them, but it's great now we're into Bobby's centenary by a few days now. 1923, it kicked off in August.
Yeah, well, tell us a little bit. This is Bobby the Wonder Dog, known as Bobby the Wonder Dog, and he got lost basically when missing. I'll let you tell the story, but he's a fine dog, isn't he? He's amazing.
Yeah, this one, I'd seen a few, and when I saw this one, my jaw really dropped. And this kicked off in August 1923. The family, Brazier family, Frank and Elizabeth couple, and their daughters, quite young girls, Leona and Nova, had driven from Oregon, Silverton, Oregon, so west coast of America, to take a kind of road trip. And you can see one of the images there people have seen with Bobby just kind of quite casually in the style of the 1920s. Cars were a bit slower, not much traffic on the roads, riding on the back of the car, sometimes riding on the running board. Wasn't a huge amount of room in the car with 4 people, I think. So he was often outside and just hopping on and off. Spotted a rabbit, as it pleased him, he'd come back. There was expected him to come back. Perhaps they stopped and waited, but he did. But they got to Indiana, and this was the 15th of August. So the start of the centenary has just recently passed. And the Father Frank was filling up the car at a petrol station, and suddenly 3 dogs, kind of strays, I think, appeared from nowhere and chased Bobby into the woods. And Frank wasn't too fussed because he was used to Bobby disappearing for a while, coming back. But after a bit, he's sounding the horn. Bobby isn't coming back. And they wait a little while, they search, they get more people on the search. I think they've got cousins in Walcott, Indiana, which is why they stopped there for a while. But eventually, quite heartbroken, they have to carry on, and they continue their trip as intended, which is interesting, as we'll see, in terms of the weird mechanics of this story. They go further east and a bit northeast as well. And then they start coming back. They still can't find Bobby. They leave word that Frank will pay for anybody who can get the dog crated up and put on a train back to Oregon now. He'll pay them for this if they find the dog. But they drive back long way. They stop, as they've done on the way across, at what were called rest stations at this time for motorists. America's a big motoring country. People would stop in a little kind of bungalow and fill the car up with petrol and perhaps food and so on. Anyway, these were a big part of their route as they went out and as they went back again. So autumn comes in, winter comes in, and not a very happy Christmas 1923 for the Braziers. Bobby is probably by this time left for dead, or just at least lost. And then January, and then February, and I was saying earlier on today, I think when I was talking about this, that as a historian, you've got a big store of moments competing with one another where you would like to get back to that time in that exact place and see what that was like. And above all, I think, feel what that was like. And I have to say, I think there's one other perhaps that I would love to have met: my mother's old dog, which was a legendary dog of their childhood, Pat, which perhaps we'll talk about. But the moment I think that really beats them all for me in all of history and this wide world is February. And I think it was the 14th or 15th, but it was pretty much exactly 6 months since Bobby had got lost. And one of the girls was outside the family restaurant, which was how they made their living in Silverton. And she was walking about with a girlfriend of hers. And suddenly the girl says, "Hey, isn't that Bobby?"
Wow.
The sound of this, the dog in the street, extremely mangy, dirty and scrawny, with his toenails worn down to nothing, turns around, and despite the condition he must be in, he's covered perhaps 2,800, perhaps 3,000 miles,
Wow.
hurtles at the girl Nova and covers her in kisses, making kind of desperate sounds of breathless relief. And I suppose it would be fair to call it love. And so in goes Bobby to the restaurant, has a steak and cream, and recovers up to a point. He fathers pups later on. He lives
Right.
until 1927. A vet later says that he's probably actually aged 10 years physically in the journey across America. But quite quickly, we talk about this, he becomes famous, and he becomes, as he's now known, Bobby the Wonder Dog.
That's the incredible story of, just how is this dog? I mean, we know dogs have good scent glands, or scent senses, but how did they do that? How did he track his way back home?
Yeah, the endurance is one thing, the courage is another. We do know that because the story became so famous, and it was a very big example of a motto I've learned to love: animals bring people together. There were newspaper stories and letters flying across America in no time. He was even more famous in 1924 because eventually a film got made about him, a silent film. You can still see a little bit of it. He plays
Right.
himself in the film. So this meant that letters came over to Silverton explaining that we saw Bobby, we looked after him, we fed him, we put him up. He was injured at some point. He would stay with me for a few weeks and so on. So they got a fairly good map of Bobby's journey and his route. And this meant that he actually went on further northeast, and he seems to have followed the braziers first of all. So rather than going home, which in itself would have been quite a feat, almost 3,000 miles across
Mm.
frozen American winter. I mean, no scent would survive in those temperatures
Yeah.
across that amount of time. But rather than going home, he followed them. And there's some other stories about dogs purely homing in on people, which we'll come to, which give another kind of curious side to this bewildering puzzle. And he tracked up that way for a while, as far as people know. And then, because people put all these letters in, it seems that he stopped at all the rest stations, the petrol kind of bungalow stations that they'd used on
Right.
the way over. So our best guess is that there's a kind of weird psi trail, in the sense of psi psi, that is beyond ordinary human capabilities. Perhaps some humans can do it, but he's following this kind of weird trail because experiments have been done over time in the 30s, in the 60s, and recently up to, I think, about 2020 in the Czech Republic. Quite big, fairly scientific study being done with 10 different breeds of dogs. You let them in the woods away from their handlers, see how they come back. Now, most of the dogs will sniff their way back to an owner. That's easy enough. About a kilometre they can do that. But about a third of the dogs, I think it was, and this matches other studies, the percentage is kind of alpha dogs mainly that can do this. About a third of the dogs don't sniff at all. They track, as it's termed, and tracking seems to mean using the Earth's geomagnetic field, but
Mhm.
it definitely doesn't mean sniffing. Over and over again, they've been very closely watched, videoed. A guy called Rupert Sheldrake has done this not long ago in Britain, and they're not sniffing. And what's fascinating is that they seem to go into a kind of trance state. They potter about for a little while. They're a bit unsure for a few minutes, but then their head will go up in a peculiarly kind of stiff, odd, kind of mechanical way. And they seem to do better when it's misty, when it's dark. They bump into kind of low obstacles like low walls or fences, but essentially they just keep following some
Wow.
weird kind of line or magnet that we cannot see or get or understand.
Mm.
And they get themselves back either to the home or the person. And this is an odd one, which, why is it sometimes the house? Why is it sometimes the person? It can apply with cats as well. But yeah, they seem to be using some kind of sense beyond anything that most
Like
of us have got.
like an internal compass in a way. That
That's how a lot of people have described it. I was describing it to a family with children the other day, and the boy was about 8 or 9. He said, it's got a kind of sat nav or something in its head.
mm,
When I was telling the
yeah.
story to them.
What's also interesting is maybe nowadays, if you travel with the dog, it's in your car, but Bobby seemed to be out of the car on his travels, and so may have picked up more being on the roof, or on the back of the car as well, than a dog, say, inside a car, maybe.
Yeah, there's different factors across time with that, and I think it was easier with less cars and traffic on the road. I mean, my mother's dog Pat used to just run with her and her brothers down to this common about 3 miles or so by the bikes, and that wasn't a problem in those days. And then he would play cricket with them, and he certainly had done the homing a few miles, and he was stolen at one point, and they were quite worried. And he turned up with a strange rope round his neck, got himself home. This would have been in the 1940s, I think, maybe early 50s. But yeah, you've got the kind of lack of traffic in the old days, which meant that, I mean, one case which fascinated me and gave another little clue as to how this is happening or how it's not happening, near to where I grew up in Hertfordshire, Bedford nearby, there was somebody who wrote to the papers in 1933 and described the fact that his dog had moved house with him just about 3 miles across town, basically, and it was attached to his house. So we get one of these slightly more cat-like things. It's the house, not the person. I mean, it seemed to be happy with its owner, but it would go about 3 times a week back to the old house, and the new owners of the house had instructions: feed the dog, pat it, say hello, send it back home, or just, let the door open and go back home. So it did this quite happily. It got across town 3 miles, it got back 3 miles, and it did it about 3 times a week. I'm not sure how old it was. I think it was a terrier. I'll just check that detail because the breed thing is quite interesting, especially to someone who's got a terrier type dog.
Yeah.
And yeah, 3.5 miles in Oakley in Bedford. And the dog was in fact a fox terrier. But the most interesting detail about this, and the person ends the letter with the question, how does the dog find its way and avoid the traffic? So there's enough traffic, even just horse and carts, I suppose, to be a problem. The reason they asked this question is the dog was totally blind.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Right.
the idea that, it's
Yeah.
ordinary dogs that are not blind are not really using their sight. I'd be surprised if that dog could scent its way, across so many different conditions. I mean, if it's doing it in the winter, if you've got all sorts of interesting, tempting scents of other dogs and butcher shops and so on, it just goes on a beeline, as it were, for the old house. And it's not the only dog that's pulled off quite a feat when blind, and sometimes very old as well.
So it kind of sounds like they could have these antennae in a way that we're not aware of, that are not what we think. That they're doing something that we don't know, basically.
I,
And
I
these are the
yeah,
big questions, aren't they, where we don't have the answers, but there seems to be something else going on. But can it just be a natural thing? Did we maybe have those senses ourselves once upon a time?
yeah, I think it would have been useful for us to have them, and I suppose it would have particularly useful for people to have them. As we were saying earlier, before people could read, before they could write, um, you know, how do you find your way somewhere if there are no signposts, and if there are signposts you can't read? I mean, I've often thought, you know, if you imagine a child who's fairly agile and fit doing
Mm-hmm.
this journey, it would be a bit like that if they happen not to, you know, be able to read at whatever age they were, because the dog simply can't rely on that. I suppose it can see familiar things,
Mm.
but yeah, I think there's probably, like a lot of things that seem now paranormal, would have been fairly natural and automatic to people way back. Telepathy being a big one, I think, and telepathy between groups of the same tribe across a big distance. But yeah, finding your way home. There's one that people talk about a lot and seems to be slightly more female than male. And it's an interesting question, I think, if women are generally more psychic than men. But over and over again, and even down to CCTV records, I think it's said that women know when someone's staring at the back of their head
Mm.
over and over again. I've got to say, I'm completely ignorant. If something, oh, he's staring at the back of my head for an hour, I don't think I'd notice. But you know, women over and over again say this and give variants on that kind of thing, and you can see that, you know, way back when life was nasty, brutish, and short, if someone was staring at the back of your head and not saying anything, and you didn't know them, it would be quite good to know that they were doing it, and then you can act accordingly, so that you don't get, you know, had for breakfast or whatever.
But we can sense intent, though, I think, can't we? In other ways, without you know, without words and feelings, atmospheres. And I wonder if it's something like that that some people can pick up on when there's an energy near them that isn't gelling with them. If we can sense, I mean, I think we can
a
sense
lot.
each other, can't we? You know,
A
we can
lot of
feel.
people say that, you know, you get one person walks into a happy party at a certain point and everything goes kind of prickly.
Yeah,
Or just a friend of mine, very academic, you know, very left brain in lots of ways, said if you go into a room and teaching has just happened there, you know that that's happened. You know, the room could be completely empty, but there's this weird kind of buzz of
yeah.
all the talking, arguing, shouting that's been going on in
Mm.
a good tutorial. And yeah, that's one example. I think a fascinating one, we know so much more if we knew why dogs and cats and children see ghosts when adults cannot, or certainly in the case of dogs and cats, they know something's there, you know.
Mm.
And the most fearless dog that's kind of trained to fight to the death with other dogs, or lions for that matter, will flee in absolute terror from something that nobody can see or hear or anything else. And this has been borne out, you know, in lots of cases, and especially with the children's accounts of somebody who's not frightening, and the child doesn't think they are a ghost, and they just want to know who they are and why they're in the house and so on. And
Yeah.
they turn out to be dead, and they turn out to have lived in that house before, and
Mm.
so forth. So I think there's something about the right brain, really. You know, that old thing which has its pitfalls and can be quite sexist, but that idea of the right brain, the left brain, and the fact that we know for sure, you know, this is scientific stuff, that children have this kind of second birth into puberty at about 9 or 10 or 11. They have a radical change in their consciousness, and there's nothing else like that in life, really. That strange drop into self-consciousness, you know, when after that you think, how could I have never been self-conscious like this before?
Mm.
Or I was never shy, or whatever it might be. But yeah, I mean, when you talk about antennae, it's a nice phrase, because it reminds me of a story which is slightly sideways of this, but is so astonishing that I've never come across anything like it. There's a great character I've been researching called Christine Granville, and she was known as Churchill's favorite spy. She was a Polish Jew, ended up spying in occupied France in the 1940s. And she was an incredible character, I mean, absolutely fearless and indomitable. Really, in the end, she got bored with not having a war after it finished, it seems, her biographer implies. But anyway, she had two experiences with animals where I've never read anything like it. She was on the border with a fellow spy trying to get into Turkey from, I guess it would have been Bulgaria, and the customs people were giving them hell just to purely be nasty, really. So they'd taken the car to bits, kept them waiting in a cold hut half the night, and at one point, while they're in this miserable situation in the mountains waiting to get across, this guy comes in with a ferocious Alsatian on a lead, and it leaps at the male spy. And the handler says, "Don't go near him. Don't go near him. He's the most ferocious dog I've ever had." Christine, and one day there will be a film of this if they can possibly replicate such a thing. Christine leans down and gets her hands on the dog, and it turns into the most kind of soppy puppy in an instant.
Right.
A few, I don't know, about an hour later, they finally get permission to go across the border. They're driving with great relief through the pouring rain through no man's land. I think it is a kind of zone about 3 miles between the actual, customs posts, and they're driving towards Turkey when suddenly Christine says, "Stop the car." Now, how she knows to stop the car, I don't know, but he stops the car, and she gets out in the pouring rain and whistles, and this dog comes hurtling from the Bulgarian side through the pouring rain towards her in an ecstasy of love. The animals just met her about an hour ago for the first time, and they speculate, shall we take the dog with us? It clearly just wants to be with us more than with them. They decide they can't really, as spies, feed a large Alsatian dog all the time in small cars, so they send it back again. Anyway, there's a second version of this story when she's in occupied France one night. The Nazis are on the prowl, and she dives under a bush. And as she's sitting there, there's an Alsatian kind of trained, German dog off the lead. So it leaps on her under the bush, or she's trying to hide till they've gone past. She simply puts her arms around the dog. And again, it falls in love with her, is really the only way you could describe it. Instantly. I mean, she it possibly saves her life, the fact that she does something to this dog without trying immediately, and they keep this dog until the end of the war, and I think it goes off with them afterwards out of France, but it becomes theirs. So there's something there. Whether it's women that can do that a bit more, I don't know, but there was something very remarkable about Christine Granville and that kind of bond with an animal. It's spooky stuff, really.
Yeah. Some of these relationships with your pets are very intense, where you can feel you're really connected with your pet. And then people who have pets but don't have that connection, and you always kind of feel like they're missing out on something, or is there a reason why they're not connecting with their pets? I don't know, there seem to be like two kind of people who have animals but don't really get the amazement of them, if you really take time,
Yeah. I mean, I bumped into a lady today who's doing very well at 90. She's always out walking her dog, and I bump into her there on the sort of village green. And she was saying to me the other day, he got in a strop, George, a little white West Highland Terrier. He wouldn't go home the way he was supposed to go. Something had gone wrong. He hadn't been given his biscuit at the shops or something, pretty traumatic. So he's probably got PTSD from this now. But anyway, he wouldn't budge, and she wanted to get home. And she finally said to him, "George, I need a wee." And at this, he turned and bolted back with her as fast as he possibly could. And she said, "I talk to him all the time." She lives on her own with the dog. She talks to him all the time. And certainly one night, she couldn't get him to go to sleep. I mean, she ended up giving him half a sleeping pill because he was so restless. And in the night, she found he was waking her up again in the middle of the night. And she realized that the boiler cupboard was overheating because there was a leak in the boiler, and none of the alarms would register this, but the dog knew something was wrong, the moisture, the temperature. And I don't think he saved her life, but it is evident that he would have done if he'd needed to. And I think there's such a complicated set of things, the type of dog, the type of person, and so on at play there. But certainly there are cases where the dog doesn't go home to the house or flat or whatever it might be. The dog goes to the owner. And there's a lovely case of this from the First World War. A guy called Private James Brown from County Cork in Ireland. It's Buttevant, I think it's called. He was with a regiment there as a soldier before the war, just before hostilities started, First World War. And he and the regiment would have this new dog. I think it was a puppy, Irish Terrier, perhaps a cross, called Prince. And the dog would romp about in all directions as they went marching. And by the end of the day, they're completely beat with their packs and their feet and everything. And the dog is still romping about crazily. Anyway, the dog loved Brown and it loved soldiers. This is what it knew from the very start. Presently, he's drafted into the war in France, and his wife goes over to live in Hammersmith in London, I think perhaps staying with relatives, but this is where she takes Prince, obviously enough, because they don't have provision for untrained dogs in the trenches. And she sends him a letter, James, in September or so. It doesn't get there till November, but he gets this letter saying, "I'm very sorry to say that although we're all well, Prince has disappeared and we can't find him anywhere." And James says, "Well, I'm sorry to hear that Prince has disappeared, but you're not likely to find him there while he's here with me," which he was. Prince had somehow got to the coast from Hammersmith, somehow got on a boat across the channel, and I think most bewildering of all, found Brown down in Armentières, quite a way into France.
Incredible.
And this was all verified, and everyone was so staggered by this that the commander got them paraded before the troops the next day. He became the heroic mascot of the regiment, not least because he could kill rats at an incredible rate. He killed 137 in one day. He had his
Wow.
own khaki jacket. He would ride about on his own horse in the jacket, and wonderfully, along with James, survived the war, and they both went back, I think, in 1919 after the long sort of demobbing thing. So yeah, he's one dog among a few. It's not the only case where the dog has actually found its owner. And of course, we've got the implication here, which might have caused a bit of tension in the family home afterwards, that the dog did love James more than James's wife. I think you can see that he'd spent all his puppyhood with James and soldiers, so that kind of was his world. But yeah, dogs that have got this weird kind of compass beam magnet on the person, not on the place.
Place. Yeah. That is incredible. And I believe those bonds are out there. There's just something, well, it's evidence, isn't it? It's not in writing, but it's there to be seen. And I don't know, it's amazing. When you also think about birds, did they have the same um technology in them? Those pigeons that can go all over the place and come back home. Um Things like that. What's the difference, do you think?
Yeah. I think they are more aware for some time, aren't they? Because pigeons are so well known for this. And obviously you've got the phrase homing pigeons for a while now, that they use something magnetic. I think there's something about their brains that allows that. But they're not the only birds to do this. You've got pet birds, magpies, I think, but certainly birds of other types that will find their way back to a family that has adopted them, and then they sort of say, well, look, let's leave the bird here when
Mhm.
we go back home off holiday, whatever it might be. And ducks can do it. Cats as well can do this. A rather kind of sad thing, actually, in the animal kingdom is that, of course, cows and calves get routinely split up in the farming trade.
Mm.
And there's a case fairly recent from, I think, Devon, which is cited by a researcher called Robert Charman. And he has this case where the cow and calf are sold to different farms, and they are separated that night. And in the morning, the cow is found 7 miles away on the farm of the calf, suckling the calf. And this implies that it's pretty traumatic for this seemingly routine separation to happen, and that, yeah, they can overcome it. The cow has never been to this place before. They know that they're the same animals because they're still tagged as per the auction. So yeah, a wide variety of animals can do it. Dogs
That
and cats are known for it, I guess.
Yeah. That initial love for your child, whatever it is, your baby, is very powerful, isn't it? In animals, in a mother, in humans. So you can only imagine how much more it's provoked when things like that happen, when separations happen, and if animals have an ability more than we do to, you know, go back to what they need to find the way to things, then you can only imagine the energy, you know.
Yeah, I've seen similar stories about their young with so many animals, primates, but elephants as well, and it's striking how that kind of love can also pretty quickly be formed with humans, and the extremes of it. There's a guy called Roger Foots who actually wrote a wonderful book about chimpanzees and their abilities, and he researched this at quite a pivotal time when not that much was known about them, American University. But his early experience of an animal's kind of intelligence and devotion was they lived on a farm, he and his family, and they went out doing some stuff at harvest in a Jeep. His brother decided to cycle home because he got his bike with him. So the older brother's cycling home in front of the Jeep. It's a very dusty kind of time of year and place, and dust is blowing out in huge clouds. They can't really see in front of them. So they're toddling along in the Jeep with the boy there on his bike a little way ahead. Anyway, suddenly the dog goes crazy, and it's either running beside the car or it jumps out of the car, but it goes crazy, and they can't work out quickly enough what it's bothered about. The next thing you know, the dog has actually thrown itself under the wheels of the car and is killed. And the reason it does it is because Foots's brother has fallen off his bike and is about to be run over himself. And
Wow, that's
yeah,
incredible.
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and certainly, they form bonds with strangers in surprising number of cases. A lovely story which I'm able to follow right through from the beginning to the end, really. I think it was about 1878. It kicked off in Victorian England. It's around Sussex that there was a dog which became known as Railway Jack. It was a terrier again. I think pretty non-pedigree, probably a few crosses in it. But this terrier dog, of which there are pictures still, suddenly took to riding on the trains from Lewes, particularly in Sussex, down to, say, Brighton, Eastbourne, stations on the way there. And it had a routine. It would get off a certain stop, go to the pub, get given some biscuits, get back on the train. And somehow the dog always knew how to get back to Lewes on the last train. I mean, no one really understands it, and it did stranger things over time, but it loved to sleep in the station in the waste paper basket in Lewes. And over time, it started doing longer journeys. Some of them might have been accidents, I'm not sure, but it would start to go to Paris on a particular train. It would go up to Scotland, and it was the guest of honor. It came back covered in ribbons, having been the guest of honor at a wedding in Scotland, where it was also feted by the station staff, because by this time it was famous from the newspapers. And over time, it was presented to royalty 3 times. It became the star of various dog shows, which was quite a feat, not being a pedigree and eventually having only 3 legs, because of course it did eventually get hit by a train, but was saved by a kind of canny vet. Presented to royalty, given silver dog collars, luxury dog baskets, which it spurned to carry on sleeping in the waste paper basket. But over and over again, across God knows how many hundreds of miles, maybe thousands, this dog always found its way back where it wanted to go. But more than that, it had been absent from Lewes and thereabouts for a while when there was a funeral of one of the station staff, and suddenly the dog turns up at the funeral, and it wanders about quite respectfully behind the procession, goes and looks in the grave like everybody else. And it did this, in fact, twice with 2 different employees. It got its way back
Wow.
after a long absence, and found the church, found the person. Now, I could believe this story because it's well attested, and the dog did a lot of strange things. It was famous. It had its obituary in about 25 papers when it died.
Wow.
But I got another clue to it only very recently, and this is perhaps more extraordinary than anything else we've heard before. It's a dog in, I think it's the north of England, border collie, so one of your bright, sharp, nervy dogs, called Spot. And the dog's owner, Dennis Goodyear, was a farmer, and he had died at a reasonable age. He was 73. He'd raised the dog since it was a pup on his dairy farm in Sutton near Macclesfield. And the dog was then, I think, given to new owners. There didn't seem to be anybody in the old family to look after it. Anyway, it presently disappears quite some time after Dennis's death, disappears from the home of the new owners. And it turns up, it is found in the village churchyard, whimpering across Dennis Goodyear's grave.
Wow.
Now, if a dog can home in on its owner, which it has done a few times at least, and cats have also done the same, that's pretty weird. But if it can home in on its owner when they're dead, we've got another kind of strange piece of the puzzle, expanding it outwards. But, you know, was that dog, and was Jack, Railway Jack, back in the Victorian period, actually tracking the person's soul?
Yes, yeah. That I was just going to say, actually, you know, history is really important. You know, of course, it's important. And you being, you know, a doctor of English, you know, have more understanding of words. We often use words we don't really know when we're saying them what we're actually meaning, and also their original meanings. And this is why we need to go back in history, is to listen to those stories, because we kind of lose a lot through the years of just secondhand information, people saying something, we just, you know, repeat it, kind of thing. But there's a lot in history that's we need to look into, which you obviously have. I know that. That kind of might give us more clues if we took the time to look, which, you know, the normal person doesn't really do that. So, you know, can you go back in any time? Well, I think you're doing that now anyway. This tracking thing, this soul thing. Um, what was the relationship, you know, a long, long time ago with animals and humans? What was going on back before, you know, we had words maybe.
Well, yeah, then we're in prehistory, and unfortunately, by definition, we don't. We depend on archaeological evidence and things like cave paintings and so on. I just, it's really a guess, and I'd be happy to be proved wrong. But I suspect that people probably had a bit more of these animal abilities themselves then. I think that was probably the case. But certainly, if you just go back hundreds of years within written history, Rupert Sheldrake has a case from, I think it's the 16th century, where a guy called Zollikofer, Swiss, he moves to Paris from Switzerland, which obviously is a fair distance, and he leaves the dog with friends or somebody back in Switzerland, and the dog follows him to Paris. So we've got these cases going back hundreds of years. There's a lovely case from a character called Wyatt, who was jailed by, I think, Richard III. There's a lot of people in the Wyatt family over the centuries, but this one, I think, was jailed by Richard III, and he was left in pretty rough conditions without any food. His jailer wasn't allowed to bring him any food, and famously, there are pictures of this animal. How accurate, I don't know. They're drawings, but there was a cat that came bringing dead pigeons through the bars to Wyatt, and the jailer said, "Well, look, I'm not allowed to bring you any food, but I haven't said I can't cook you any food if the cat brings it." So he was possibly kept alive by this cat, which I must send you a picture of. But certainly the Victorian period is especially rich, I found. I mean, it's kind of Victorian and back, so that I start in about 1800 with these animal stories. It's a story that goes beyond dogs and cats, because one of the fascinating things about that era was that you might never travel more than about 30 miles outside your home town or village, and that was the way it was in those days. But you had a very good chance of seeing an elephant, a tiger, a lion, a Tasmanian devil, a kangaroo, because the menagerie brought the animals to you. It traveled across Britain. So that was a fascinating thing. What was it like for the first time ever to see an elephant trotting down the road? Because that was the easiest way to transport it. When you'd never even seen one in a picture. What the hell is this bloody thing doing in Devon? You've got all that very wild side of nature, actually. And people tended to keep animals and snakes and things that they wouldn't often do nowadays. You could be in the middle of Oxford and you get a python suddenly coiling itself around you because some student had decided this was a fashionable element.
Right.
fashionable animal to have in its lodgings. But with the dogs and cats, I mean, there's such a rich history because the press is so detailed and so kind of blooming in those days. You've got a lot of local news. Obviously, the press isn't competing with radio, TV, and the internet, so that people are happy to read long stories. And there's one, as you say, if you get just one story, sometimes you learn a lot. There was one in France where a guy was accused of a crime which he evidently hadn't committed, but he spent a long time in jail in Paris. His dog was allowed to stay with him, and the dog loyally waited, I think, in the cell. And the trial finally came on, and the dog was either in the courtroom or just outside the courtroom, but waiting for the outcome. The outcome was not guilty. You're free to go. It's all over. And what was fascinating about this was the man was from Perpignan, as was the dog. And although you might imagine the dog flying at the man in joy, because it kind of picks up what we were talking about earlier, the vibe in the room, that everybody's happy, everything's fine again, the man's friends were there celebrating. The dog doesn't go in to celebrate with him. The dog disappears immediately. And it turns out that the dog has then made the journey to Perpignan, which I'm trying to get the distance here off the top of my head. It's a long way, and it's interesting, I think, similar kind of miles per day to what Bobby and other dogs have done. Yeah, it's actually 720 miles from Paris to Perpignan. The dog gets back there at quite good speed, and it's done it simply to go and tell everybody in Perpignan things are okay. And I think, as far as I remember, the dog gets the news back before anybody else does. This is 19th century, and it's sometime in the earlier part, it's before 1845. So yeah, the dog, just by going crazy with joy at the door, makes it clear that everything's okay, and then the sort of human news comes down a bit more slowly. But the newspaper reporter is quite shrewd about it and says, well, the dog had obviously spotted that his owner was okay, so he doesn't really need me anymore, but the family aren't okay, so they do need me. So he goes to the family to give them the news and, put their minds at rest.
It's incredible, isn't it? The more I'm hearing about this, you just wouldn't think it, but they are clever, obviously. There's we just don't give them enough credit, I think. When you hear stories like this, there's no doubt there's something going on with these animals that we just, you don't know what it is, but they have it.
That's it. I mean, because they can't talk, we assume a bit too much. And dogs, really, they're just like walking and romping and eating. But there's obviously a lot going on that we're not really able to decode easily. If you take the trouble, I suppose, and you get a case as strange as that, then it kind of hits you a bit harder. It's hard to ignore. But yeah, I mean, loyalty certainly, not strictly to your owner. There was a woman who came into the news, I think that's when she died in 2015, called Margarita Suarez. And this was, I think, in Mexico. But she was known for looking after lots of stray dogs. She was known for taking care of dogs that didn't really have a home or owners. And when she died, all the dogs that she'd known turned up in the chapel where she'd been put to rest. And being quite laid back about this, so, well, dogs have got much right as anybody else to pay their respects, perhaps more, in fact. So you can see photographs of these dogs, loyally kind of sitting there and just sort of seeing her off. And again, you have to sort of wonder, is there something of her there that they've homed in on? I don't think they've been to this chapel before. How did they find their way there? And I don't know if it's particularly near her house, but again, is the soul lingering on there for a little while, as has often been believed, and they are kind of just keeping the faith with it, as it were. They look quite peaceful in these pictures. But yeah, I mean, cases where animals, again, they attach themselves to people slightly accidentally. There's a lovely one in France in 1938, I think this was. It's pretty well attested. It was in the British Times, and they had an Alsatian dog in the Alps in Savoy, which was their postman, and it lived on kind of, you know, ground level, as it were, but it went up this mountain to a fort of soldiers in Solier, 10,000 feet up in the Alps, regularly in every kind of weather, with sacks of post on its flanks. And it would always get there, you know, no matter what snowstorms were blowing across the mountain top. And this dutiful dog, they only got very fond of the soldiers. It was retired, pretty much worn out by all the traveling up and down, and was living happily at Lons-le-Bourg, down at kind of sea level. Everybody was friends with the dog. But one Saturday, the dog evidently decided, my time is up, this is it. And he struggled all the way up the mountain pass, despite being, you know, probably the equivalent of about 80 odd years old for a dog, and said goodbye to the soldiers and fell dead in front of the barracks.
Wow. It's just, you know, so many words, is there to describe those things? And
There aren't. No, I mean, I think why some of
incredible.
them,
Yeah,
some of them
incredible.
I'd love to see films made, you know, and
Yeah.
because it did make a film of Bobby, it's perhaps time to do another one, because the silent one, I think, is mainly lost. But yeah, I mean, every country, not quite every type of dog. I think, you know, the experiments established that it's alpha dogs, upper intermediary type of dogs, but it's certainly not the obvious sniffing dogs. You know, it's
Mm.
not beagles, it's not bloodhounds particularly. I mean, there was a case in America where, if you were told that a dog had got lost in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Kentucky in when was it, the 1940s, it must have been about 47, and had finally come back home to New York, where the family lived. They'd been on holiday, and it had jumped out of the car in the mountains. It had finally come back 16 months later, having walked 1,000 miles. And you say, guess that breed. You probably wouldn't go for a Pomeranian, but that was what it was.
Wow.
And had trekked 16 months and 1,000 miles back through a
It's,
fair bit of traffic, I suppose, you know, 40,
yeah,
47, 48, 49.
that's incredible. But I mean, those little dogs are really hardy, though. You know, they might be small, but they're tough little, tough little things. You know, my dog doesn't even come up to my knees, and she's a tough little thing.
A lot of those dogs are great characters, aren't they?
Yeah.
Terriers, you know,
Mm.
little animals. Sometimes you wonder if, you know, the dog is quite fluffy and it's quite cute, so that actually means that it gets fed and looked after by people on the way, rather than if it looks fierce and wolfish or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, there's a big European one which is particularly lovely, which doesn't quite get there with Bobby, but it's not bad. There was a guy in Germany, in Solingen, West Germany, in the 70s, had an Alsatian dog which got too big basically for his flat. He decided, the dog was called Barry, and he gave it to a friend who got a house, I guess, or a bigger place. The guy goes with the dog on holiday to Bari in the very south of Italy. While
Mhm.
it's in Bari, it gets lost somehow, and it's given up for lost when the guy comes back to Germany. And after, I think, pretty much exactly a year, the dog turns up in West Germany, in Solingen, on the doorstep on Christmas Eve, having walked
Wow.
about 1,200 miles and across some, you know, we don't know the exact route, I don't think, but there's probably a fair bit of mountainous and
Oh, it's
surely wintry territory.
yeah, it's gonna have to go through some Gotthard, you know, Switzerland or the Mont Blanc or whatever, getting through into Germany. So yeah, that's a heck of a trek. But I had some good food on the way back
I guess
over
somebody,
there.
you know, is not going to make that over a year without. I don't think it caught all its own food, so there must have been
No,
some
definitely not.
anonymous dog lovers, which we
Yeah,
can't talk to perhaps anymore. But there might be people that still remember this dog. I guess, you know, it's just
yeah.
50 years ago this Christmas.
So what about the other side then to these stories where the animal is passed on and yet they are coming back? Have you got any accounts
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
of
very
those?
much. Dogs and cats. Ghosts of horses are recorded as well. But dogs and cats are ones I've come across the most. A friend of mine originally from America, now lives in Britain. When in America, they had what many cat owners will know as a typically faithless cat. It belonged to a chap down the road, but it would always sleep on my friend's bed every night without fail. And one Thursday it was, she noticed that the owner, when she bumped into him, was looking rather down and unhappy. He said, "What's up? What's up?" And she said, "Well, the cat died on Tuesday." And she thought, well, it's been sleeping on my bed throughout the week for 2 nights, just as before. And she still felt the weight of the cat. So what fascinated me, it wasn't just seeing the animal, you know, see it and then put your hand through it. She had no idea that it was dead because she's got this ordinary weight of the cat. I've never made any noise. I must ask her about that. But, you know, typical weight of a cat down at the end of the bed on your feet. A lady I bumped into just by chance, really, about this time last year when I was on holiday, and got talking to her outside a house in a garden, told me a great number of ghost stories in about half an hour. And one of the ghost stories was a dog. I think it was a big one, a St. Bernard or a Newfoundland. But anyway, the kind of animal that on wooden floors, you'd hear its claws going pretty routinely, you know, in an old house like hers. And yeah, took it to the vet, sadly, when it was very good age and really had to go. Had the dog sent to sleep, and that evening there it is going round the house as normal. And somebody said to me, you know, as though it's just perfectly normal and absolutely used to it, somebody in their 60s, that all their pets, dogs, cats, they all hang around, come back, whatever you call it, for about a week after they've died, just to sort of say goodbye and smooth things over. And yeah, I'm trying to think of cases where people have seen them. Yeah, there's a case in England reported by an old Times journalist. I think it's Harry Ludlam, who writes about ghosts generally, but he's got some ghost dogs from an English house. 20th century, perhaps kind of, you know, about 50 years ago. But there were ghost dogs in this house, and the live dogs, of which there are, I think, a couple, were perfectly happy with them. They didn't bark at them, run away, bristle, whatever, as they might at some kind of ghosts or spirits. So they played with the ghost dogs. So yeah, it was an easy kind of friendship and partnership, I suppose. But yeah, they sometimes stay a long time. On the whole, most of the cases seem pretty peaceful. I mean, some people more superstitious in certain cultures or times have been allegedly scared to death by ghost dogs. There was a notorious shaggy black poodle on the Isle of Wight in the castle, Isle of Man, sorry, which was supposed to have scared a soldier to death one night. But on the whole, you're just sort of comfortable animals that sit by the fire with you after they're supposed to have gone, and much cheaper to feed as well.
Yeah, obviously. It's interesting because when I was over on Bigfoot Odyssey, when I had my dog Barney, lots of people knew Barney because he used to snore in the background. He was a big snorer.
Yeah.
And he passed away at the end of 2019. And at New Year, and we didn't mention it, me and Kerry, on the shows because I couldn't really talk about it at the time. I was so upset because it was such a sweet dog. But the minute, and nothing had ever happened when I was doing Bigfoot Odyssey on the screen, but when we announced Barney had died, we started seeing orbs. Kerry could see orbs, and people could see orbs on my screen, and that had never happened before. And it went on for a couple of weeks, where we talked about dogs or pets, so it was just kind of mentioned. These orbs would appear. I mean, never seen anything like that before. In all the 5 years I've been doing shows, you know, nearly 5 years of shows with him. It just makes you think, doesn't it? Like,
no, I've never heard of that with animals, but I can thoroughly believe it. I have heard many, you know, cases with lights which actually can turn into a ghost, to turn into a, you know, full apparition of a person. There's a famous one in London in the 70s. And there's a film actually someone sent me a while ago of Paul McCartney in an interview, and he's talking about John Lennon. And suddenly a blue light appears on the screen, and McCartney doesn't really miss a beat. He said, yeah, that's John.
Wow. There's something going on. I would love to experience something, but I'm also don't want, a bit worried. I don't know what would happen. So I think I have this kind of barrier up. So there's like very little that happens to me. There's been a few things, but that with Barney, the orbs. But I mentioned before the show that Kerry had passed away.
Yeah.
And we made a tribute kind of video towards him. I put this video together with a friend that took clips of Kerry and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it made this video about him. And while we were putting it together, I've got my friend like on the other side of the screen. He's in America, just like you're sat on the other side here, and we're putting it together.
Yeah.
And I had a video of Kerry playing a song on the piano. And I can't remember the exact song, but it's something called "I'll Keep the Lights On For You." And we're kind of listening to it, and we're kind of getting sad. And my friend's going, "Oh, I'm tearing up here." And I said, "I'm going to go make a cup of coffee." And I went in the kitchens, and my lights started flickering in the kitchen. They've never done that.
Yeah.
Four bulbs, and they all start flickering. And I'm playing this Kerry's, like, "Keep the Lights On," and I just thought, I mean, this is just so coincidental. I mean, is it just a coincidence? I don't know.
I think, in older times in Britain, in America, and I think in other countries right now, as we sit here, nobody would even have asked that question. They would have known for sure that was somebody coming back to say goodbye, And I once met a woman, just once, only once, face to face, and I'd been quite heavily into researching ghosts at that point. So I was talking about it to everybody, really. And she said to me, when she was about 14, a friend of hers, boy, died in a tragic accident. It was electrical or a fire, but it was very sudden, no kind of build up or anything. It was with an illness. And it was the most traumatic thing that had ever happened to her. And a couple of nights later, he turns up in her room, and she sees him in her room looking at her as if to say, everything's okay, it's all right, don't worry. And she tells her parents, and her parents more or less tell her to shut up and stop talking nonsense. And I asked her, well, have you told that story to many people? No, I haven't. I mean, that, she by now is about 30 odd. That's
a long time.
It's a long time, and it's one of the most important things that's happened to her in her life, and she can't talk about it. And I'm pretty struck by the fact that, although it took me quite a long time to get ghosts, I have to say, I think if enough people keep saying the same thing to you, you have to actually pay attention. You don't misuse language and say that's purely anecdotal. Nobody says it's purely anecdotal when someone stands up in court and swears a statement. It can send someone to prison. It can send someone to the electric chair in America. That's not purely anecdotal. They start saying, well, I prefer a rational explanation. Why do you think what I've just told you is an irrational explanation? It's not irrational in the sense that it's gibberish, nonsense, madness. It requires a different framework expanded beyond what we understand as reason and science, but it isn't irrational. It's not illogical. And there are so many cases like this. Sometimes I think, well, that could have been a coincidence. I think what you're saying, there's so many cases with lights behaving like that. It was certainly was Kerry saying goodbye. But a friend of mine died much younger than we ever would have expected, when he was just 70. He was kind of chap who would keep pace with you hiking when I was, I don't know, 45, no sweat. His uncle was racing about in his sports car at 93, and Christopher had cancer out of the blue. And I was down in Rye Harbour, taking a little cottage there to go to his funeral in 2016. It would have been. It's quite bleak time of the year, and it was the end of January, which is a pertinent point, because Christopher was a great naturalist, and I've always had this weird experience. Whenever I see a flower or hear a bird or see a bird, and I'm not quite sure what that is, I always think reflexively Christopher would know. And it was only at the funeral we got told by one of his old friends that Christopher had the biggest collection of biggest private collection of butterflies in the whole of Britain, and they now sit in Glasgow University, where he studied first off. He was Scottish, and in Oxford University for the English ones. So
That's
yeah,
amazing.
I knew he was still scrambling up hillsides in Albania when he was about 68 to find some
Wow.
butterfly that people thought was extinct in 1960 something, and he got hold of one in 20, 12 or something like this. Anyway, I was sat there after the funeral by the fire, feeling a bit glum that evening, and it was a cold, gloomy day even for January, and suddenly there was a butterfly on the chimney piece, and okay, Christopher would know what type of butterfly it was. It could have been a moth for someone as ignorant as me. So I'm open-minded about that,
Yeah.
but it's a very strange time of year and an unlikely time to have a butterfly turn up. And I think at least to be open-minded. I think, unfortunately, amongst various kind of modern diseases we don't really recognize, one of them is this ridiculous taboo making people embarrassed about ghosts and the most important things that ever happened to them. But another one is that you have to be certain, and I think religion has a real problem that it has to be certain, and the kind of ferocious certainty that allows you to be absolutely sure you are doing the right thing has been the cost of so many lives.
Yeah.
Down the centuries, but also in science, actually, where people now have this kind of odd label of skeptic, and they're very proud of being a skeptic. They haven't got the faintest clue what the word means, but they know that they're super hardened skeptics. And in fact, they're so absolutely certain that this cannot happen, and that cannot happen, and that cannot happen. They won't even bother to read about it. They won't listen when they're being told about it. And they end up being just as religious as your most, confirmed fundamentalist, because their position is absolutely rigid and they're absolutely certain. So I think it's just good sometimes to be fairly sure, but never quite certain. There's always another question and another story.
You're absolutely right, though, about people not being able to talk about their experiences, and that's kind of what me and Kerry built up, was a space for people to come and share their encounters, where no one's going to laugh, no one's going to make fun of you. It's just a place for you to, offload what you experience. We don't have the answers, but just sharing something, and then I don't know if it's happened to you, but when you start talking to people about what you're interested in, suddenly, something happened to me.
Yeah.
There's just nowhere for them to have talked about it. In fact, I reconnected with a friend recently, and he
Yeah.
came round and he said, "Oh, I've got a spooky thing to tell you." He said, "It's not something I can talk about at home."
Uh-huh.
It's because people are worried about what people are going to think of you, but things are happening to people, whether they're paranormal or not, we don't know. But you can't take people's experiences away from them just because you don't believe or it doesn't make sense, because none of it makes sense. Even religion doesn't even make sense, so we have to, like you say, be open to other things going on. It can't just be what you believe, because there's not even proof of what we believe in many instances. We just believe because we've been conditioned to believe, or for whatever reason. Really solid proof is very hard in all of this. But like you say, we go off people's experiences, and
I think people's stories, and absolutely the sense that all these stories are there, kind of suppressed and silent and waiting to be vocally joined up into a big critical mass in the way that other stories have been. It's striking that American and British culture, particularly on the left, values itself as open to fearless, open conversations about abuse, about children's historic abuse, about women's experiences in Hollywood, the whole Weinstein thing, and so on. And yet, it has created a very, very hard, difficult new taboo around in just a few years. I mean, the Victorians were much more open about this. And I've been amazed at how many stories I can get in one day from complete strangers. They're not the stuff of Hollywood movies. These aren't crazy people. I mean, every possible type of person is telling ghost stories and poltergeist stories. Lawyers, teachers, builders, farmers, writers, historians, everybody has got these stories, you know. So the whole sort of rational, irrational thing, it's far more irrational not to listen to what people say and to have to shut it out. And as you say, you know, people's experiences being taken away from them, it very much came across to me. I've been reading books on the 1960s purely for social history, nothing to do with the paranormal, but in 4 different books I've just picked up wonderful ghost stories or paranormal stories. One of them, which I won't go into great detail now because it might suit another show, but Marianne Faithfull has a life-changing experience, and ends the account of it with the words, more or less, people have seen me as mad, but I'm not going to change my story just because it upsets other people's view of reality. And I think this is a big, big unacknowledged thing that, you know, for a lot of people, and for myself, 12, 13 years ago, the paranormal was a source of great violence, kind of slamming you in the head sideways, throwing all this indigestible stuff at you, which initially can seem nonsense or craziness. And you have to listen, and you have to compare a story with another and another and another. And it was only recently that someone I'd known for quite a while, by chance, I said, oh, I'm writing this book on ghosts, and her eyes light up and she said, we really need a book like that, we need something like that. And yeah, she's known the same person since she was a child. It's a very sweet story in some ways, that he's been her boyfriend for quite a few years, and they grew up together in the same village. They also grew up around and in a very, very haunted house. The family still lives in it now, back over in England. Everybody in the village likes the family. Everybody in the village hates the house. Innumerable people, friends, visitors, guests, babysitters, have seen ghosts, have heard crazy things going on. And you know, the family will be sat at Christmas downstairs after a meal around the table. 3 women, the woman I'm talking of says that her sister is more psychic than her, but she and her mother, the 2 women and their mother, are all looking at each other, wondering when the men are going to acknowledge the fact that upstairs it is going. And it's not the sound that pipes make, and it's not the sound that pigeons make on the roof. You know, it's, you know, the sound of your own house after you've been there for 20 odd years. Everybody does. You know when it's right, you know when it's wrong. And if it's wrong, it usually means something obvious like a bust pipe or you know, the roof's going or whatever. But you know, they know that this house is haunted from every possible angle, every possible witness. And the men are all sitting there trying to pretend there isn't a huge racket going on upstairs. The suspicious thing being that if you go up the stairs, it immediately stops in the way that most ordinary noises aren't going to. You know, it's a shy ghost, or ghosts perhaps. But yeah, there's something very gendered about this, and you know, quite astonishing. People who've known each other so long will talk about everything pretty much, I would have thought, but somehow have to agree not to talk about the most important questions in our lives, and probably in our future lives as well.
Definitely, definitely. It's fascinating, isn't it? And we are almost, well, we're going over the hour. I don't know if you're all right with that. I know you wanted to
That's
read.
okay. That's absolutely fine.
Are
No.
you okay? Yeah. We'll get into more detail. We'll definitely, I would love you to come back again, and we
Thanks.
can get more
It'd be
into
great.
that ghost side. Because I've got lots of ghosty things. A
Yeah.
couple of things that happened to me I'd like to share.
You'd love to hear.
We
Yeah.
can get into that. But let's finish off with, I know you have a passage you'd like to read, something you'd like to.
Yeah, I'd like to share this because a friend I was mentioning before has done some great research in the paranormal, Robert Sharman, and he gave me this book, which I never would have come across otherwise. And it's a guy called Michael Bentine, who was best known for the kind of goon comedy stuff back in the day, you know, I think 60s and onwards. But he was also heavily into the paranormal from an early age, and there was a group around him who was psychic. And one guy was particularly interesting because he was a very ordinary, normal, modest character called Eddie, who was known generally as Eddie the Grocer. He ran a grocer's shop in, I think it was Dover. And the family, just before the Second World War, in the very tense summer of 39, when it's clear that things are going to blow quite soon. They're living in Kent, and Benteen at this point is young. I think he's probably a teenager, and he's really going to explode with all this fear and tension. And Eddie has a sense of this in the way that perhaps someone psychic particularly would. So he says one evening in September, I think it is early September, to no, sorry, it's the summer still in 39, to Benteen's father, Adam. Tell you what, why don't you drive us out into the country? It's not far, and there's something I want to show Michael. And this is the exact passage, which I've never come across anything else quite like. We duly drove out a few miles into the Weald of Kent, those peaceful, sheltered valleys that are one of the most attractive features of the Garden of England. Eddie asked Pop to draw in to the side of the country road. Then we got out and followed him down a short, narrow track that led to some woods at the foot of the valley. The night was calm and quite warm, with a few lazy clouds drifting across the moonlit sky. We walked silently in single file through the lush ferns that now rustled round us. The dense underbrush continued as we passed into the thick clumps of trees which made up the small wood. Here the light was considerably reduced, yet Eddie continued to lead the way effortlessly. Quite unexpectedly, we came out of the clusters of saplings and mature trees into a small clearing, which must have been centrally placed in the wood, and there Eddie stopped. The moon had come out from behind a large, billowing cloud and now lit the whole scene almost as brightly as daylight, but with a soft, silvery light. You could almost hear the silence. Eddie turned to me as I stood a few feet behind him, just in front of my father. He smiled and gestured to me to listen. Then he turned and, in a low voice, halfway between a whistle and a word, gave one strange, short, gentle call. Immediately, from every corner of the wood, the birds, the beasts, even the insects, and I felt every tree and plant, answered him. It was a great, joyous chorus of greeting to a much-loved friend. There was no alarm in that spontaneous answer, just a massive response of nature to nature, like attracting like. Tears streamed down my face, and I could see my father crying too. Marvellous natural tears of joy that seemed to wash away the fears and doubts that had assailed me, reaffirming that nature is far stronger than man alone. I shall never forget that moment.
Wow. What an experience to
Yeah.
feel that, yeah. It's there, isn't it? There's something there. There's a connection that we don't know about that they have. And yeah, we're missing out big time, I feel.
Yeah, Eddie was psychic. I'd like to know more about him, but he clearly was psychic. I think he was a medium.
Right.
But I've read a lot about mediums, and I've never come across anything quite like that. I suppose there's a broad parallel with Christine Granville, Christina Scarbeck, as she originally was, who had this uncanny bond really with dogs and perhaps other animals as well. So yeah, you get little glimpses, but that particular kind of chorus, of answer is something I've only ever come across there.
Yeah. There is a lady, I can't remember her name, but it's Anna something, and she can communicate with animals. She communicated with a leopard who
Yeah,
wasn't happy where it was living. And I don't know how she did it, but she was communicating with this thing. She could understand what was wrong with it and
yeah,
how to change things with it. And she's done it with other animals. I mean, there's people with those. There's some. I mean, people who work with closely with animals, with horses, because they're quite not
yes,
complex, but there's a way,
yes.
isn't there? And some people just naturally can connect with these things, and that's something that you can't really train for. That these people just seem to have a natural
No,
ability to do that.
no, I'd like to know more about that. I
Mm.
wonder if it's with her and the leopard, if it's telepathy of some sort, a very odd kind, obviously, because it's presumably not involving language. But that
Yeah,
it would compare with things I've read about people having out of body experiences and communications with I don't really know what they are. You know, sometimes they're ordinary dead people, but sometimes they seem quite beyond that. And these communications seem to involve a whole kind of holistic batch of data coming into your head, you know, and there's no words, there's no speech, there's no sound, and
Yeah,
it seems to be far superior to what we, you know, think is impressive communication, whether it's spoken or written. It's something way beyond that.
definitely, definitely. And as we come a full circle here, Callie the Wonder Dog, this is your latest book, is it? The one that's
Yeah. There's actually a couple of new fictions out. Another one's big on the subject of nature, 10 Days That Changed the World. But Carly has the advantage of being one that I think works for kids and adults. So you could, you know, buy it for your 10 or 11-year-old and then constantly be pinching it off them when they're asleep to catch up on the story. It was inspired a bit by Brexit, and the research ended up doing in another book, The History of Disgust, about very vicious right-wing politics in the 1930s. I mean, most people probably know the film The Remains of the Day, where the kind of well-meaning, you know, slightly doddering aristocrat is hosting Nazis in his stately home, and this was really going on in the 1930s. And worse than that, you know, you got someone like Mosley was given by the Home Secretary of the government a police escort of thousands, many of them mounted police, to ride into the Jewish East End with his fascists, with the black shirts, at a time when, you know, the Daily Mail had not long ceased running headlines such as "Hooray for the black shirts." So yeah, I was thinking across this long stretch of, you know, right-wing politics, and ended up setting the book in the 30s, but thought it'd be great fun to tell the book from the viewpoint of a dog. So there was actually a Newfoundland dog, which is the one you can see on the cover. It was slightly different color originally, but way back, this is in A Singing Mouse. There was a dog that made a lot of money for a theatre company in Drury Lane by simply jumping into a tank of water and pulling out a baby night after night on the stage. This was a hit, The Caravan, in about 1804, and little children all sort of agog and squealing in the audience. And so this goes into the story. It's a story of a dog that's lost in Britain. Where is the dog from? What's its true identity? It's kind of hijacked to exemplify Britishness and British heroics, and so it's taken to Loch Ness, to Stonehenge, to see the Cottingley ferries and so on. But you know, is it actually British, and what does Britishness mean? And is there something beyond this miserably racist right-wing identity that has got to be as small and, you know, in inverted commas, pure as possible? Or is there something huge and ever expanding, ever unfolding, colorful, diverse, encompassing, that is British identity? I mean, I love cycling around Cardiff, just watching everyone play cricket in the summer, and it's one of those great British things that's been kind of exported. And then, of course, as with so many things, the foreigners do it better a lot of the time than the English. But yeah, you know, it's a great thing that's kind of British and Indian and Sri Lankan and West Indian and Australian and so on. So yeah, cricket is a big thing in the story, and it's a great fun romp where dogs finally save the day. I won't give it away, but dogs
the
rescue.
Too much away. I will put some links in the description so people can have a look at all the books that you've written. I know you've done quite a few, and they can go and check you out there. And there's a link out for Instagram and for your TikTok. But Richard, it's been fantastic talking to you. It's been really interesting. I can't wait for the next time. There's lots more to talk about. There's so many holes to go down with these subjects. So thank you for that. Thank you to everyone. Sorry, Richard. Thanks to everyone in the chat. It's been really good to see you all. I'm going to be back here at the weekend to catch up with you all, to let you know what I've been doing over the last few months, and to see what you've been doing as well and what I've missed out on. But until the next time, guys, you take care, and I'll see you all soon. Good night.